How's it going? Tuesday, March 7th, 2023. Book I wrote, Old School versus New School Baseball. What do I mean? 150 years of baseball, I divided into two 75-year periods. First period, 1872 through 1949. 75 years. Old school. Second period, 1950 through 2022. New school, 75 years. Which players during those eras was better at certain categories? I covered batting average in a previous video. Old school won. I covered most hits in a season. Players, Hall of Fame players. Old school won. I covered runs scored, most in a season. Individual players. Old school won. 3-0 old school. How about runs batted in? Who wins? You have to look at individual years and then take a decade and average it out. 1870s. I start with 1872 through 1879. The average runs batted in, 56 runs batted in for a season. The high, Jim O'Rourke had 72. 1880s. The average, 107 runs batted in. Talking about Hall of Fame baseball players. Who had the most? Sam Thompson, 166, 1880s. 1890s. The average, 135 runs batted in. And who had the high? Sam Thompson again, 165 runs batted in. I take a 10-year period. For example, 1890 through 1899. The individual with the highest runs batted in for the season. Take all 10 years of the individuals and average it out. That's how I came up with 135 runs batted in 1890s. How about the 1900s? The average, 106. Who had the high? Honus Wagner, 126. 1910s through 1919. The average, 107 runs batted in. Who had the highest? Frank Baker, 130. 1920s. This will be interesting. Average runs batted in, 150 runs batted in. Wow. So that's the highest of the decade so far. Who had the highest? Lou Gehrig, 173. 1930s. The average eclipses even the 1920s. The 1930s, 169 runs batted in. And who had the high? Lou Gehrig, 180. Nope, my mistake. Hack Wilson, 1930, 191 runs batted in. Woo. And then the 1940s, the average is 127. It goes down because of the war years. Who had the highest? Ted Williams, 159. So the aggregate of that 75-year period, average it all out, between 1872 and 1949, runs batted in, 119. Let's look at New School. How'd they do? 1950s. The average, 130. Very good. Who had the high? Ernie Banks, 143. 1960s. The average, 126. Who had the highest? Orlando Cepeda, 142. 1970s. The average runs batted in, 125. Who had the highest? Johnny Bench, 148. 1980s, the average 118. The high for the decade, Andre Dawson, 137. 1990s, the average 125. Good decade. Who had the highest? Ken Griffey, 147. 2000s, the average 126. Who had the high? David Ortiz, 148. And then 2010s, the average 100 RBIs. And who had the high? David Ortiz, 127. So, who did better in the 75-year period? The old schoolers, where their aggregate for the 75 years was 119. Or the new schoolers, what's their aggregate? Indicating you take all the decades from 1950 to 2022 and average it out. Guess what? New school, 121. Old school, 119. New school, 121. So the new schoolers were better at runs batted in. Interesting, right? As far as batting average, old school. Runs scored, old school. Total hits, old school. But as far as runs batted in, it's new school. How do I come up with that? You average it, you do the stats, put it in a book, and facts do not lie. Runs batted in. See, let me tell you the old school just to refresh you. 1870s, 56. 1880s, 107. 1890s, 135. 1900s, 106. 1910s, 107. But then the 1920s took off, 150. Now listen to this. The 1930s, 169 was the average. The 1940s, 159. So they had some good decades. 20s, 30s, and 40s, very good in runs batted in. But what's interesting about the new school decades, 1950 to the present, is that they stayed consistent until the last decade. 1950s, 130. 1960s, 126. 1970s, 125. 1980s went down a little because they had a strike that one year. 118. 1990s, they had a strike also, but it was 125. The 2000s was very good, 126. And then the 2010s, 127. So like I said, the aggregate between 1872 and 1949 was 119 for old school baseball players. The aggregate for new school was 121. They beat them by 2 points. Thought that was interesting. Next, we're going to get into home runs. Who has a better average of home runs in the decades? Stay tuned. I'm out.